G-Man Boxing. Do you know what I mean? Every single live he donates. I see him on other lives donating. He's got the bag on it.
Alright, people. Tyson Fury, Dillian Whyte happened this weekend. Dillian Whyte, obviously we all know, lost 6-round KO to Tyson Fury. A lot of people are wondering what is he going to do next. He gave an interview straight away to Sky Sports. He's obviously been with Sky Sports for a while. I'll talk about that later on at the end of this video. But I just thought, why not have a look at Dillian Whyte's career from the start right up to this point, and at the end maybe give an idea of what I think he may do next. So, what we're going to do in this video, we're going to have a look at Dillian Whyte's career. We're going to ask the question, what the fuck happened to Dillian Whyte?
Let's go! I'm ready!
Oh, I do so enjoy doing these videos. Do you know that? These WTF videos are some of my favourites. I don't do them too often, but when I do, I enjoy them. So, Dillian Whyte, the body snatcher. Born in April 1988. Obviously born in Port Antonio, Jamaica, came to Brixton when his family were 12. Let's have a look at Dillian Whyte. Dillian Whyte had a very limited amateur career. You know, BoxRec will tell you he was 1-0 as an amateur, his only win in the amateur coming against Anthony Joshua. Not true, he had more than one fight, but not many. He had 6 amateur fights, 5 of which ended in KO. AJ went the distance. He's the only guy in the amateurs. At the end of the day, 6 amateur fights. I mean, just that alone would really tell you that, like, if you hear of fighters turning over with 6 amateur fights, not at a particularly high level, you wouldn't think that they would achieve much, if in fact indeed anything. But Dillian Whyte, obviously he had his amateur fights. He was trained originally from the kind of start of his amateur career right up until he joined Jonathan Banks. That was when he was in the Klitschko camp. He was trained by a guy called Chris Okoa. Now, if that name rings a bell with anyone, Chris Okoa was Commonwealth, I think it was it British or Commonwealth? He was Commonwealth, I think, back in the 1990s as a cruiserweight. That's about as far as Chris Okoa went, and he's not really been training. I've heard certainly nothing of him training any other fighters other than Dillian Whyte. And he trained with him from, as I said, 2008, started the amateur career up until 2015, when he swapped over to Jonathan Banks, which we'll talk about now in a sec. But Dillian Whyte's pro career, it started in May 2011, and interestingly, you know, people may talk about Dillian Whyte's weight and, you know, should he be lighter. His actual pro debut was a 4-rounder against a guy called Taira Muhammad, and he was 252 pounds in that fight. So I'd imagine that he was quite a bit overweight in that fight. And this was actually on Sky Sports, believe it or not. Early on, Dillian Whyte was actually fighting. I don't know if he was promoted by him, but he was definitely fighting on a couple of Frank Maloney shows. You know, he was fighting. These were all small halls. Now, this was on Sky. This is back when Sky were doing Friday fight nights. Friday fight nights, if you think about it today, like, it's really, they were glorified next gen shows. Remember Eddie Hearn used to do the next gen shows on Sky? You know, you guys like Tom Dallas, Brian Rose, Sam Webb, the super welterweight, lost in the 12th round. He was defending his British title against Prince Aaron. So that was Dillian Whyte's pro debut. He won it on points. And, you know, he was just fighting journeyman. He came back out in September, 20 pounds lighter against the guy who was 17 and 40, another journeyman. This was actually this was in South London as well. Mickey Hellett was on another small hall show. Tony Visks. So the first 2 fights he had, by the way, were points decisions. This is when he got his first stoppage. And this is one of the lightest weights of Dillian Whyte's career. I think, in fact, it might even be the lightest weight. He was 226 pounds in this fight. So bear in mind, he turned pro in May 2011, and this is December 3rd, 2011, and he lost a good nearest makes no difference, nearly 50 pounds in between. At that stage, he might have even been in the Team Fury. It might have been even when we saw the picture of him with Tyson Fury where you had the abs. So he was obviously putting a tremendous amount of effort in, and that was his first stoppage. Hastings Rossini, that was on another Frank Maloney show. That was actually on the undercard of David Price versus John McDermott, believe it or not. So Dillian Whyte I don't even remember if Sky even showed a lot of the earlier fights on some of them undercards, but that was one of them. Gabor, we're moving up the card here a bit. Gabor Frankes, I've seen him a few times, but that actual fight with Dillian Whyte, clearly don't remember. This was going into 2012. 2012 was when he really stepped on the gas and was fighting a lot more regularly. A lot of these fights were more down in York Hall, but he was getting a lot more stoppages at this point. So in 2012, he had 6 fights. He had his last fight in 2012 in October of that year, and that was actually on Channel 5 on a Mick Hennessy show. That was actually on the undercard of James DeGale versus Khalid Mamidi. And Chris Eubank Jr. fought on that card as well, won an 8-round decision. So Jordan Gill in only his second pro fight. We all know Jordan Gill nowadays. But when you look at some of these old cards, you do forget like how many fighters were actually like fighters you would associate. Like you'd associate Jordan Gill obviously with Eddie Hearn. James DeGale, you would associate him. Well, he kind of flip-flopped from everyone. But as far as you'd associate with kind of Eddie Hearn, Eubank Jr., you kind of he's really his own kind of boss, to be honest with you, more so a boxer now. Or Sky, I should say. But these were all fighting on some of these small hall shows that Frank Maloney, that Mick Hennessy were putting on. So that was Dillian Whyte's last fight in 2012. Now, he wouldn't fight again, and it was against the guy, by the way, who went by the name of Sandor Balaga. He was 3-25. And again, none of these guys, one of them had a winning record. And that was a guy who was... Dillian Whyte knocked him out in the round, actually. He was Christian Krivalov. I think is how you pronounce that. 2-0 and 1 draw. And this guy Mike Holden, to be fair, had a winning record. He was 10-9. So he was not fighting guys. He was not fighting a who's who. Again, he was building himself up. He was fighting on these small hall circuits, just basically getting his record up. Now, October 2012 was when he had that fight. That was on, as I said, Mick Hennessy. He wouldn't fight again until November 2014. And the reason for that is Dillian Whyte bought an over-the-counter supplement called Jack 3D. All right, you get Jack as in JACK 3D. You can still get it now, but at the time, it had a substance which was on the banned list. So they weren't playing around, and they slapped him with a 2-year ban. All right, now Jack 3D, as I said, it's still on the market nowadays, but I believe. Like, I remember back then, people in gyms, just in gyms in general, were talking about Jack 3D, and they were saying how, like, you will just be lifting, you'll be going for days on that. So you can imagine what was in it then. I mean, nowadays, you can get it on Amazon for dirt cheap, but I think whatever was in it at the time is no longer in it anymore, so it's all good to go now. But Dillian Whyte made his comeback. He made his comeback in the Camden Centre on Friday, 21st of November. That was actually on the undercard of Darryl Williamson versus Lewis Van Porsche. He's a journeyman light heavyweight, but Dillian Whyte fought a guy called Annette Vercura. Alright, so 2 years removed from the ring. He had done some sparring at the time. He'd actually been in team, it would have been around about this time, he would have actually probably been in team Klitschko, because it was kind of around about then when Klitschko was getting ready to fight Kubrat Pulev in around that time in 2014 that him and Anthony Joshua had an altercation, had a bit of a falling out in that camp, where Dillian Whyte apparently offered AJ a straightener on the street, and AJ was like, we'll settle that in the ring. And the next week, funny enough, and it's very rare you see this nowadays, the next week Dillian Whyte was back out again. And one does make you one. Oh, actually, I was going to say I read the weights wrong there. I thought they were saying he gained like 10 pounds in a week, but he lost 2 pounds in that week, again, to losing 2 pounds in the week. But that was actually Dillian Whyte actually was in the Camden Centre again. He topped the bill this time, and he fought a guy called Thomas Marzek, who was 9-49. So again, really picking up from where he left off. You weren't really going to expect Dillian Whyte to be, again, living an amateur career. No one really knew who the hell he was at this stage, but he was starting to kind of slowly but surely get a bit of heat at this time. I think this is kind of when he was kind of starting to maybe come onto the scene a bit. And then in December of 2014, he got a 3rd round stoppage over a guy called Kamil Sakalowski. Kamil Sakalowski was 1-0 at the time. And yes, that is the Kamil Sakalowski we know, who is a bit like... He has a journeyman's record, Kamil Sakalowski, but he's better than a journeyman, to be fair. He's better than a journeyman. One would wonder if he'd had proper, if he had a proper team behind him when he turned over, like say, back with MTK we're going, if he had someone like that supporting him, I'm not saying he would have won a world title or anything like that, but where would he have been? Because he's a better fighter than his record suggests. And he's only ever been stopped 4 times. He was stopped by Zhalalov, he was stopped by Nathan Gorman, he was stopped by Kosbalewski in the 10th round of a 10-rounder. So this guy takes some stopping, and Dillian Whyte was the first guy to stop him. You see the highlights there, that on screen. Dillian Whyte was able to drop him a couple of times in that, actually. He dropped him 3 times in the 3rd round, and Howard Foster stopped the fight. So Dillian Whyte starting to make a bit of headway, starting to, get a few people talking. His next fight was in February of 2015, and that was against the guy called Marcelo Nascimento, whose name does actually ring a bell. He's been in there with guys like Dempsey McKinnon, Bogdan Dinu, Evgeny Ramov, Simon Keane, Rudenko, Duapas. Chisora actually went the distance with him, and Dillian Whyte stopped him in 2 rounds. Been in there with Carlos Takam, Kuzman, Chambers, Parker. So this guy's been in there with a good few guys. Been stopped a few times as well, to be fair. In fact, he's been stopped in pretty much all of his fights. Like, look at that, 22 losses and 15 of them by stoppage. So Dillian Whyte fought him in his next fight. That was again in the Camden Centre. But then he actually was able to get onto TV. He was able to fight once again. This was actually on ITV. I remember this fight actually quite well. Was when he fought a guy called Beka Lubjanje. I think is how you pronounce that name. At the time he was undefeated. He was 5-0. He's subsequently got on to he stopped fighting after 2015. His record was 8-4 come the end of it. But this was on the undercard of Carl Frampton versus Chris Avalos. I remember this fight actually well. It had guys like Anthony Kakache, Marco McCulloch, Conrad Cummings, guys like that. Paddy Gallagher, I remember him. So it had a couple of these on the undercards. This was the first time we really got a chance to see Dillian Whyte just to a wider audience. And he wouldn't fight again until August of 2015. And at this stage, Dillian Whyte had left his original trainer and he started training with Jonathan Banks. Now, Jonathan Banks at this time was the trainer of Vladimir Klitschko. So he was in the Klitschko camp at this time. Jonathan Banks, a disciple of Emmanuel Stewart, was trained by Emmanuel Stewart when he was fighting. Obviously, he took the ropes from Emmanuel Stewart after he passed away, took over Vladimir Klitschko and started training Klitschko. So he would have been, Klitschko at this time, in 2015, would have still been the heavyweight champion of the world. He would have been fresh off of the fence over Brian Jennings, so he'd be getting ready at this time for a fight with Tyson Fury. So Dillian Whyte obviously was in the Klitschko camp, and he had his first fight with Matchroom on Sky, and this was at Crave Park Stadium in Hull. This was on Luke Campbell versus Tommy Coyle, and this was on August the 1st, 2015. At this stage now, Anthony Joshua would have already been on the Kell Brook Frankie Gavin undercard, which was on pay-per-view in the O2. I think that was on about June, July, or maybe earlier, maybe it might have been May of 2015. So AJ was really starting to get a name for himself. Like, people were really getting hype with Anthony Joshua at this stage, and Dillian Whyte was literally being brought in. I think everyone could see it as someone they were seeing as a sacrificial lamb to the slaughter. Amateur beef, bit of beef stemming from the Klitschko camp. Bring Dillian Whyte onto some of these shows. He got a nice knockout against this guy, Arano Costa Jr., who was 17-4 at the time, knocked him out in a round. He was down twice in that round. So it was able to get people to have a look at Dillian Whyte, see what was there. His next fight then would actually be on Anthony Joshua's undercard against Brian Mintu. Now, Brian Mintu, I have seen, he was he was small, 212 pounds in this fight. He's really a cruiserweight. And Mintu, he'd been beat by guys like Joseph Parker. He'd been kind of fluctuating between both divisions. Like, look here, beaten by Michael Sprotton, prize fighter, beaten by Arthur Spilka on points. Had a crack at Marco Huck in 2010 for the WBO cruiserweight title, lost that, stopped by Areola. So every time he'd stepped up, he'd been beaten. And at that stage, Brian Mintu, he'd seen better days. Dillian Whyte dropped him in the first round. I remember that fight well, actually, and was able to get rid of him in the 3rd round. Now, as I said, on the top of the bill was Anthony Joshua versus Gary Cornish. That fight didn't last long, but Eddie Hearn was stating that once this fight's over, the next fight will be for the vacant British heavyweight title. AJ picked up the Commonwealth title in this fight. So they were looking to do Anthony Joshua versus Dillian Whyte. There was a lot of buzz around the heavyweight division at this time. They were getting ready for Tyson Fury, Vladimir Klitschko. Wilder was doing his thing over in the States. So the heavyweight division was starting to finally, after being in the doldrum for many, many years, because it really was bad. I mean, I think people forget how bad it was during the Klitschko era. It wasn't just bad because the Klitschkos were very, very good, but the rest of them were just garbage. Like seriously, I mean, Ruslan Shagayev, really, guys like that, you know, Tony Thompson, no disrespect to him, but like he was considered the best American heavyweight at one stage. I mean, Tony Thompson today, at his best, would he beat Andy Ruiz? Best for best, would he beat Wilder? Hell no. Would he even beat guys up and coming like Anderson? So the heavyweight division at this stage was starting to kind of come to life a bit. Obviously, Tyson Fury went over to Germany and beat Klitschko 2 weeks before Anthony Joshua and Dillian Whyte were set to meet. I remember actually, this was, I think, the 12th of December 2015. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't that when McGregor beat Aldo in UFC? Because I remember actually, clearly in 2015, actually, I remember this very well. I was working in the gym at the time, and there was from November to December, just before Christmas, there was just a sporting event, whether it be in UFC, whether it would be in boxing or something. There was always an event, a sporting event on every week, whether it be a big fight, whether it would be just something in the States. There was always something kind of going on around this time. It was a fun time. But anyway, Dillian Whyte went in there with Anthony Joshua. People didn't really give him a prayer. Like I said, he was 16-0, AJ was 14-0. Dillian Whyte fought a lot better than people gave him credit for. He done a lot better than people gave him credit for. He buzzed AJ in the second round. He had a slightly injured shoulder, which I believe personally, because you're not going to tell your opponent you're injured. The way Dillian Whyte loops his shots, it's going to happen. You're going to obviously hurt yourself at some stage. And just as well as that, he was chasing Klitschko around the world. Klitschko was getting ready for the Fury fight at this time, so Jonathan Banks was not going to be paying that much attention to Dillian Whyte. And I think Dillian Whyte knew that, because straight after this fight, he was stopped in 7, as you see there, and it was an uppercut. That'll become his Achilles heel at one point. But Dillian Whyte realised things got to change. I can't follow Jonathan Banks and Vladimir Klitschko around the world when Jonathan Banks is Klitschko's trainer. That's who he's going to be given his main priority to. That's it. He's going to be focusing on Klitschko. I do wonder, and this is just me just wanting to play devil's advocate here, Vladimir Klitschko, after he lost to Fury, he only fought once more. That was against AJ in 2017. Right? I do wonder, because Jonathan Banks hasn't really done much since Klitschko, pretty much since he lost to Fury. You know, obviously he trains Triple G now, but I do wonder if Dillian Whyte had stayed with Jonathan Banks, because he would have had a bit more time to work with him. You know what I mean? Like he would have been able to commit to Dillian Whyte more, because Vladimir was winding down his career. So I do often wonder, what if he'd stayed with Jonathan Banks? Because Jonathan Banks had Dillian Whyte, at least from Dillian Whyte's a good puncher, but Jonathan Banks had him really focusing more on the power shots. You'll see that in Dillian Whyte. And in 2016, Dillian Whyte, got his comeback planned. He went to the UK, joined with Mark Tibbs. Now, when he joined with Mark Tibbs didn't have Dillian Whyte hitting as hard. Certainly from the eye to see, he was definitely focusing a lot more on picking up points with his shots. You'll see it if you look at some of these fights Dillian Whyte was having here. Like, he fought a guy here in his first fight back since the loss to Anthony Joshua. This was actually on the Anthony Joshua Dominic Brazil undercard. That had George Groves, had Eubank Jr., had Dillian Whyte lower down the card. He fought Ivan Baruchin, and again, a very, very small guy for heavyweight, 209 pounds in there, but stopped him in 6 rounds. Didn't look particularly good in that fight, did Dillian Whyte? Really didn't. Was able to get rid of him in the end, but he didn't look amazing in that fight. Yes, he was out of the ring for 6 months, which by his standards would be seen as quite long, but he looked a bit, it was a different style altogether to what he'd been used to, being around the Klitschko camp, in there with Jonathan Banks, working with now Mark Tibbs. He had his next fight in July. It was July 30th. That was in Leeds. That was actually on the undercard of Josh Warrington versus Paul Hyland. And Dillian Whyte fought Dave Allen. Now, Dave Allen was seen as just It was a strange one. Dave Allen was on a few Matchroom shows. He'd beaten Jason Gavin, I remember the fight before, and he looked pretty poor in that fight. Jason Gavin was a really, really, really poor journeyman. Like, he was really bad, like real poor. And he looked poor in that fight. So not many people gave Dave Allen much of a shot in this fight against Dillian Whyte. And Dillian Whyte, Dave Allen has a good chin to his credit. And he got a few shots in from Dillian Whyte. But Dillian Whyte was content to just box Dave Allen, boxed him for 10 rounds, picked up the win. And his next fight would be in October of 2016, and that was against Ian Lewis, and this is for the vacant British heavyweight title vacated by Anthony Joshua, who went on to become world champion, beating Charles Martin. Now, against Ian Lewis, and this was actually on the undercard of Ricky Burns versus the guy's name escapes, the Belarus guy, Kirkle Relic. And Dillian Whyte, I think that was the co-feature, wasn't it? It was actually. It was the co-feature. Dillian Whyte beat Ian Lewis, and Ian Lewis from Brixton as well. But Ian Lewison, he can punch a bit, but he was way out. Like, he was in very poor shape in this fight, 273 pounds. I mean, Ian Lewison, some of the weights, like Ian Lewison, like realistically, at one stage he was weighing in the 240s in his career, and that was a good weight for Ian Lewison. The 270s, he just looked a big blob, simple as. Next fight after that in 2016, it was 4 fights in 2016, and he only started in the second half of the year, so one would wonder how many fights he could have got. But his next fight would be against Derek Chisora. That was in the MEN. That was on the AJ Molina undercard. And the build to that fight was brilliant because AJ Molina, it was a real lose your boner type fight. No one wanted to see it. Everyone was just on the flop for it. It was just, ugh. I mean, just Molina, just no. But Derek Chisora and Dillian Whyte were able to get the show. People were interested more in it because these guys had a bit of beef. You had the incident where Derek Chisora threw the glass of water over Dillian Whyte, and Dillian Whyte just threw the glass back at Chisora, and they had to get security in the sky. Gloves are off to restrain both guys. You know, you Derek Chisora throwing the table at Dillian Whyte. You had Dean Whyte, you know, with his famous "that's some baby" thing. You know, so the build up to that fight was fun. The actual fight itself was a good slug match. I mean, both guys really gave it all in the ring. They got the crowd very lively. Dillian Whyte escaped with a split decision. At the time, I thought Chisora did enough to win, but when I watched it back, I thought Dillian Whyte did actually nick it. Just slightly, but it was an entertaining fight nonetheless. Now, Dillian Whyte was actually meant to fight in June of 2017. It was either late May or early June. I think it was early June. He was meant to fight Mariusz Wach. That was the headline, the O2. Rumour mill was that it just wasn't selling. That the people just were not buying that fight. And that fight ended up getting just binned. And Dillian Whyte would actually fight on the undercard of, I think it was Terence Crawford, wasn't it? It was the undercard of Terence Crawford versus Julius Ndongo. Eddie Hearn was actually working with Ndongo going into that fight, believe it or not. And he fought a guy called Malcolm Tan. The original opponent, here's a funny one for you, bit of trivia. The original opponent for Dillian Whyte on that show, funny enough, was actually Michael Grant, the former heavyweight contender in the 90s, the guy who got wiped out by Lennox Lewis. That's who the original opponent was for that fight. And it was bizarre. It's one of the few times I remember this ever happening, but the fans were so outraged by it that they actually swapped the opponent to Malcolm Tan. And I'll be frank, Malcolm Tan was garbage. I mean, he gave little to no resistance. I mean, I get people didn't want to see Michael Grant get beaten up because he was aging. I think he was in his late 40s. But it made no difference. He was in there with a grossly overmatched opponent anyway. But I remember that well. His next fight was then against Robert Helenius. This was on the undercard of Anthony Joshua versus Carlos Takam. That was in the Principality Stadium in Cardiff. Dillian Whyte was rocked quite badly in the second round in that fight. Helenius fought quite a very negative fight, and Dillian Whyte was able to get the win on points, did what he needed to do, but he really looked, you saw some of the flaws in Dillian Whyte's game in there, especially when he's having to look for an opponent. When the guy is being negative, Dillian Whyte was looping shots, he was missing a lot. His footwork's always been terrible, but his footwork in that fight was not great at all. Swinging and missing on Helenius a lot, but nevertheless was able to get the decision. So then it was at this point Dillian Whyte started getting more of a name for himself. People started really taking a bit more heed of Dillian Whyte, taking a bit more notice to him. He was getting a bit more attention. And in March the 24th, 2018, I believe this was the week before AJ fought, what's his name, Joseph Parker, he would headline his own show in the O2 against Lucas Brown. They built it as a former world champion in Lucas Brown. He was regular champion. He was stripped of that title almost immediately. He had a crack to get because apparently he failed. Well, he failed the drugs test over in Chechnya. I always felt that was very suspicious because it was against Shagayev and he failed for, I think it was clenbuterol. I always felt that was very suspicious because Shagayev is best mates with the president of Chechnya. There was a lot of things that happened with Reza Kendo over there, so I always felt that a bit suspicious. But having seen Lucas Brown's decline since then, and he hadn't even been in any wars since then, I kind of think maybe it wasn't set up because he failed. He was meant to fight Shannon Briggs in the end of 2017 or 2016? It was 2016. He meant to fight Shannon Briggs, and he actually failed again. I think it was for Osterine this time. The thing Povetkin failed for in December of that year, and that was the end of that. But he went in there against Dillian Whyte, absolutely shot to pieces. Dillian Whyte beat him from pillar to post, as you'll see there. It got quite uncomfy after a little while because how bad Lucas Brown was in terms of his aesthetically, and he just was shot to pieces. Dillian Whyte knocked him out cold with the left hook, showing his tremendous punch power in that punch. And then it was a weird one because then it was a case of Dillian Whyte wanted a world title shot. So there was talk of him having a final eliminator against Kubrat Pulev. I cannot remember who won the purse bid. Apparently it was to go to purse bid, and some crowd, I never heard of them, I don't remember them, it wasn't Eddie Hearn, it wasn't Top Rank, I don't know who it was. Won the purse bid, was going to happen in Bulgaria. Dillian Whyte was like, not going to Bulgaria, I'll take something else. So Hughie Fury ended up getting that fight, and he went to Bulgaria. So opponent was needed for Dillian Whyte. There was a big rumour that it was going to be Luis Ortiz. That was the rumour. Ortiz, fresh off a loss to Wilder, there was a big rumour going around at the time that it was going to be Luis Ortiz versus Dillian Whyte on pay-per-view. It wasn't Dillian Whyte, it wasn't Luis Ortiz. It was announced it was going to be Joseph Parker. And I want to talk about this card itself. We can say all we want about whether you like Eddie Hearn, whether you don't like him, whether you agree with some of the cards he puts on. This card right here was one of the best cards Eddie Hearn has ever put on, in my opinion. I mean, you had just fun fights from start to finish. You had Nick Webb versus Dave Allen. That was a fun little scrap. You had Joshua Boazzi in there. He got a nice little first round stoppage. You Conor Benn versus Cedric Paynow, which was a real kind of coming of age fight for him. He started to really improve after that. You had Derek Chisora in that great, that was the Joseph Parker versus Dillian Whyte was a great fight. But Chisora Takam was fight of the night. I mean, that was just so much fun. That was a great fight to watch. That really, if you've never seen Chisora Takam, watch it. Brilliant fight. Loads of shots being thrown. Hell of a scrap. Then in the main event, obviously, you had Dillian Whyte versus Joseph Parker. That was a good fight. Dillian Whyte dropped Joseph. Dillian Whyte was getting outboxed badly for the first 2 rounds, but towards the end of the second round, a head clash, went in, dropped Joseph Parker. He was a bit kind of all over the shop from then on. Was dropped in the 9th round, but Dillian Whyte was able to rally late and drop Dillian Whyte in the 12th round. Dillian Whyte just held on, got the win that night. That's probably Dillian Whyte's best win. Yeah, that would be, because that was a Joseph Parker who was a fight removed off the AJ unification. He wasn't past his best. Next fight then after was against Derek Chisora in a rematch from their 2016 affair. Another tough fight. He did buzz Chisora early on in that fight, but Chisora was a bit reckless, ended up getting points deducted and went for broke, got caught with a left hook and was taken out. Ringside at the Chisora fight, and who got in the ring straight after, was Anthony Joshua. So 3 years removed from when they met in the ring at the O2 for the British title, they're in the ring together. Now, Sky Sports had a plan for Anthony Joshua in 2019, alright? They wanted a day out in Wembley Stadium. I believe it was April 19th, I think, was the proposed date, where they wanted Dillian Whyte versus Anthony Joshua. AJ at this time was unified heavyweight champion. He had 3 of the 4 belts, so they wanted a day out in Wembley. There wasn't that much hype around the rematch, certainly not amongst the hardcore fans, maybe amongst the casuals, but that was what Sky really wanted. Now, I think the purse Dillian Whyte was looking at was in around 4 million, And he felt that obviously wasn't enough. So he decided no go on the AJ fight. AJ, it was announced then that he would actually, the Wembley date would be scrapped. He would actually go to MSG and fight Jarrell Miller. Now, Jarrell Miller subsequently failed the drugs tests for multiple substances, and they threw Andy Ruiz in. We all know how that went. That was a big one. But Dillian Whyte, obviously, who was he going to fight? Because Dillian Whyte's fighting on pay-per-view now. They needed an opponent. I forget exactly what show it was announced at. He announced it at a Sky show. I can't quite remember who it was or who was fighting. But he announced he'd be fighting Oscar Rivas. Now, Rivas at the start of 2019 fought Brian Jennings in what was a decent fight, to be fair. A fight that Jennings was winning going into the 12th round, but Rivas was able to rally and get rid of Brian Jennings in the 12th. So Rivas 26-0. He's not a particularly big heavyweight. He was only about 6 foot. He had a very unusual. He was a counter puncher, more a counter puncher, someone who jabs, which is very rare. You see someone 6 foot tall in the heavyweight division do that. But Dillian Whyte went into that fight. That card had David Price versus Dave Allen on the undercard. It had a few. By Dillian Whyte standards, that card wasn't amazing. It had Chisora versus Spilkin mismatch, Riakpor versus Billum Smith, Coley fought on it, Dalton Smith, Babbage, one of the first times we ever saw Alan Babbage. But Dillian Whyte went in there with Oscar Rivas. He boxed Oscar Rivas quite well. He was clipped in the 9th round and dropped by an uppercut. So you see what's happening here. We're seeing a pattern here with these uppercuts, because Dillian Whyte caught in this fight and dropped in the 9th round with an uppercut. Rivas couldn't capitalise. Dillian Whyte won the fight on the scorecard. They were quite close, to be fair. 2 115, 112s and a 116, 111. Close enough, but Dillian Whyte was the deserved winner. Now, here's the interesting thing. Post this fight, it was a UCAD test where he tested positive. I can't remember what the name of it was, but there was a lot of controversy post this fight, because at this time, this was for the interim WBC heavyweight title. So Dillian Whyte was looking to get it. He'd been chasing Deontay Wilder since 2017, and right now he was in prime position to get a title shot. The only issue was that Deontay Wilder had just cleaned off a mandatory in Dominic Brazil, and the WBC ordered a rematch between him and Fury. And that was going to happen. That was going to take precedent over this. So with Dillian Whyte now having that issue with the drugs test, having everything else, it was a case of real up in the air what's going to happen next. Now, just not long before AJ fought Ruiz in the rematch in Saudi Arabia, because it was a real short notice job, UCAD basically kind of said, okay, let's just move on from this. And they announced Dillian Whyte would actually have a fight. It was really short. I think it might have even been only about a fortnight's notice. It was really short notice that Dillian Whyte would fight on this card against Marius Vac. Now, Marius Vac and him, as you remember, I said this earlier on in the video, he was meant to fight Dillian Whyte in 2017, in June 2017. That was meant to headline at the O2. Didn't happen. And actually, that card did go ahead in the O2. I think Frank Buglioni headlined, or did it not? I remember there was a card that Buglioni headlined it. I'm not sure if that was it or if it was a different one, but it was pretty much empty. But this fight happened anyway. Dillian Whyte came in at a career heaviest 271. He looked shocking in this fight. He looked absolutely shocking. He was buzzed by Marius Vac. Marius Vac, probably about 8 years past his best. Seriously, 8 years past his best. Always had a good chin. Marius Vac was able to take a few shots from Dillian Whyte. Dillian Whyte was able to get the win, but made hard work of it. Very poor aesthetically. That was probably the worst I've seen Dillian Whyte aesthetically. But obviously now Dillian Whyte was looking at 2020, was looking to get his world title shot. Obviously at the start of 2020, we knew what was going to happen. We knew Wilder was going to fight Tyson Fury, and the winner of that, well, here's the thing. I don't remember at the time if this was known, but after Tyson Fury beat Deontay Wilder, it was emerged there was a rematch clause for a trilogy fight in that contract, which Wilder was looking likely to exercise. So it kind of was a case of, you're going to have to wait again, Dillian, because not only did you have to wait in 2019, because there was obviously the Fury Wilder situation to resolve itself, there's one more fight guaranteed, so you're going to have to wait, we thought, till 2021. But Dillian Whyte signed to fight Povetkin. I believe the original date for the Povetkin fight, Povetkin, who actually fought Michael Hunter on the Saudi Arabia bill, was lucky to get away with a draw on that fight, very lucky. But the original date for that fight, I think, was early May 2020. It got pushed back. We all know what happened, to August the 22nd. This was the first time Eddie Hearn did Fight Camp. This was the culmination of Fight Camp. Obviously, the British Boxing Board of Control, I don't know why they did this, it made no sense, but they only allowed 5 fights on the card. Again, it made no sense. Nothing did really back then. But there was only 5 fights. Luther Clay, Chris Conga, that was a good little scrap. Alan Babbage Winters, Jack Cullen, Katie Taylor, and the main event was obviously Whyte Povetkin. Alexander Povetkin hadn't been looking good for a while. Like, he lost Anthony Joshua. He was stopped in 2018. He fought David Price on the undercard of AJ versus Parker. He knocked down a highlight reel knockout, but he didn't look amazing in it. Obviously, I thought he lost to Michael Hunter. He was hurt a few times in that fight. He was nearly stopped in the 11th round. I mean, Povetkin was hurt in the Michael Hunter fight, and I really think that fight did it. If he was on this decline before, the Michael Hunter fight did it. And he looked shocking in this fight. Absolutely shocking. And at this time, Dillian Whyte was really pushing for his WBC shot. He was looking at going down legal action with the WBC. He actually split from Mark Tibbs, so he was no longer training with Mark Tibbs. He brought in a guy called Xavier Miller. Alright, so he'd be training with Xavier Miller. He set his camp up in Portugal, outside of the UK. So it was a big, big shift and a big change for Dillian Whyte. And in this fight, he was dominant, beating Povetkin to the punch, dropped him a couple of times in the 4th round. Looked on course for an easy win. Really easy, straightforward win. And then in the 5th round, massive mistake, stood in the pocket with Povetkin, and boom, there it was. Big uppercut, not Dillian Whyte out cold. And you know something, at that stage, the WBC they were on about ordering Dillian Whyte versus the winner of Fury Wilder for February 2021. That was February 2021. That mandatory reset, and it went to Povetkin. And Dillian Whyte had a rematch clause. The original date for the rematch, and this was, I was scratching my head at this, was actually November 2020. They were going to put that on pay-per-view. It got pushed back to March of 2021, and that was more, people were saying it benefits Povetkin. I was like, no, it doesn't. He's going to be even older. I was like, it's going to benefit Dillian Whyte, because he got a serious concussion, I'm telling you now, from that knockout. And going in 3 months later, he's not going to be fully healed. He wouldn't be fully healed by March in all reality, but Povetkin's getting older. I think he was 41 or 42 by that stage. That fight happened in Gibraltar. Dillian Whyte absolutely beat the living crap out of Povetkin. Povetkin was a shell of his former self. He'd been shot for a while. He'd been looking on the decline for a while prior to that. The man was in his early 40s. So you had to expect that. Anyway, he was able to get rid of him in 4 rounds. Clockwork-like performance. He didn't. I would say he looked better in the first fight prior to getting stopped than he did in the rematch, when you look at it with the benefit of hindsight. But he was able to get that out of the way, and obviously the next fight he was looking at was Tyson Fury. But he wanted to get a fight in before then. So it was announced that in October 31st, 2021, in the O2, he would fight Swedish heavyweight contender Otto Wallin, a man who gave Tyson Fury a very tough fight. However, Dillian Whyte pulled out of that fight, stating a shoulder injury. It wasn't major, but it was enough to pull him out of the fight, and that fight was not rescheduled. He said he's just going to go straight into the Fury fight. WBC called a mandatory. There was a lot of issues with the purse split, who would get what's Dillian Whyte entitled to. Dillian Whyte felt he was entitled to 10 million, a decent split. WBC said, we make the decisions, 80-20, take it or leave it. They literally left it till the 11th hour to sign the contract, but they did sign the contract. We got the announcement. Tyson Fury, Dillian Whyte would take place in Wembley Stadium, April 23rd, just gone. I thought Dillian Whyte would win. I genuinely did. I think I bought into whatever. I was looking at, some of Fury's flaws and thinking, if Dillian Whyte does that, he might be able to get this win. And I picked him to win. Hold my hands up, got that way wrong. Tyson Fury didn't put a foot wrong. This scorecard from Juan Carlos Peña is bizarre. He had Dillian Whyte behind by just 1 point. You couldn't find. The first round was meh, but other than that, you couldn't find a round to give to Dillian Whyte. Tyson Fury, 1 punch knockout, took Dillian Whyte out. At the end of the day, Dillian Whyte's 34 years old. He'd been in. Look at this, right? The Povetkin knockout was savage. The Whyte fight was tough. The Rivas fight was tough. The Chisora fight was tough. The Parker fight was tough. The Brown, Helenius and Tan fight weren't tough, but the Chisora fight was tough. The AJ fight was tough. A lot of tough fights in there. That will take its toll on you. I don't care who you are. That's going to take its toll on you. And that, I think, is Dillian Whyte. Certainly, in terms of going for world honours, I think that is the end of Dillian Whyte, certainly in that regard. He's pretty much stated that he's going to carry on. I find it interesting that he didn't give an interview with BT Sport. He gave it with Sky Sports. Ben Shalom is building a stable there. I would not at all be shocked if Dillian Whyte, his next fight, is on Sky Sports. Eddie Hearn has kind of not... He's not really been, I don't want to say not complimentary at Dillian Whyte post-loss, but he's definitely not been, it's been pretty clear like that he's been like Fury was the better guy, and I kind of take that to mean that Dillian Whyte and Eddie Hearn, that ship has sailed, so I can't envision Dillian Whyte going back to the zone. The question is, we do a review on this and we ask, what do we make of the career of Dillian Whyte? Before we talk more about where he'll go or what he'll do, what do we make of his career? And honestly, like, you're talking about a fighter, as I said at the start of this video, with 6 amateur fights. When you hear of a fighter turning over with 6 amateur fights, you just think to yourself, they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to look raw, they're going to look novice-y, they're probably going to get bet before they reach any decent level. And even if they do, there's always going to be flaws there. But Dillian Whyte, a multi-millionaire, yes, he's never won a world title, but he has good wins. I mean, he's fought guys who are better than him from a technical and athletic point of view, like your Joseph Parker. Much better technically, much better athletically, much better just all around in terms of just boxing ability. He's all around better, but yet Dillian Whyte was able to go in there and make the most of what attributes he has to beat him. Rough, rugged, punching power. Dillian Whyte's managed himself for the majority of his career. He's a multi-millionaire. He's headlined many pay-per-views. He's made millions. So Dillian Whyte, when we look back at his career, we have to say, has he achieved everything he wanted to? Well, he's not won a world title, but in terms of financially secure, Dillian Whyte set himself up for life. Dillian Whyte's a smart man in that regard. He understands boxing. He understands... He's a student of the game, we know that. He's one of these fighters, not a lot of fighters do this, who religiously watches boxing. He knows a lot about it. So Dillian Whyte's been able to show that if you understand this game, even if you're not the most talented and you make the most of what you have, you can do things. I doubt he'll win a world title personally, unless Fury and Usyk, fight, they vacate all them belts, he picks up one, vacant one straightforward enough. But in terms of fights moving forward, I mean, I think that logic would tell you that the Chisora trilogy fight on Sky Box Office I reckon that's what's going to happen. I wouldn't be shocked if Jerick Chisora and Dillian Whyte both announce that they're going to go a boxer. They both fight on the same card and they do a pay-per-view fight in the autumn. Would not shock me at all. Can see that happening. I personally don't want to see a Chisora trilogy fight. I've seen it twice already, and Chisora's looking old. Dillian Whyte's not looking the best in these days. So, maybe it would be. Well, I said that about Amir Khan Kell Brook, and it could turn out to be a slugfest. It could turn out to be actually quite good fun. But that's likely what I see is going to happen next, and maybe Dillian Whyte will wait and see what happens with Fury, Usyk, if some of them belts get vacated. Dillian Whyte might look at someone like Michael Hunter, who's highly rated with WBA and was with the IBF at one stage, and he might just think, oh, you've got a vacant title there, and Michael Hunter is one of the guys. I reckon I could beat him, and you never know. But that's Dillian Whyte's career in the nutshell. It's been fun. I've enjoyed looking back at some of his fights. It brings back watching Dillian Whyte and seeing his progression, because I've seen it. I don't think there's a fight I've missed since he started fighting. Pretty much since he fought on Carl Frank's undercard, I've seen all of his fights. So seeing where he's been from then, and my progression as a boxing fan, because 2015 to 2018, that was proper stay up every night, watch boxing every night. That was me in a nutshell. I still love boxing, obviously. I love this sport so much. But back then I was just fanatical. Super fanatical. So it's been fun. It's been fun looking at his career. He's definitely done for what, as I said, like you're talking about a guy who came to the UK when he was 12 years old, kickboxing background, 6 amateur fights, multi-millionaire. You know, he's done well. He's got some good wins. We can't take that away from Dillian Whyte. That is that for this video. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. What did you think of this video? I know a lot of people like these, and that's why I try and get them out. Hope you all enjoyed. I hope I got you through your day with this. I don't know how long this video is. It's in around the 30-40 minute mark. I'll talk to you people. Smash the like button. 7,300, 200 subs gained over the weekend. That's just how we do. Get to 8k as quick as we can. Get to 10k by the end of the year. That is the goal. I know we can do it. You lot are going to help me. Share the video if you could. Thanks a mil, peeps. Peace.